Welcome back. We are continuing on with our study of the Nazarene Acts, working our way through the Rock of a Sure Foundation. We're up to Book 1, Chapter 35. So we'll go ahead and get going. After this, Moses, by the command of Yahweh, whose providence is over all, led out the people of the Hebrews into the wilderness, and leaving the shortest road which leads from Egypt to Judea, he led the people through long windings of the wilderness, that, by the discipline of 40 years, the novelty of a changed manner of life might root out the evils which had clung to them by a long-continued familiarity with the customs of the Egyptians. Meantime they arrived at Mount Sinai, and through heavenly voices they heard the law of God in all 10 precepts, of which the first and greatest was that they should worship God himself alone, and not make to themselves any appearance or form to worship. So notice the law of God is the 10 precepts. This actually lines up with what we studied from Professor Mendenhall, where he really said that the 10 Commandments was the original law, and everything that was added, the rest of the Torah, that's all just like case law type of situations. So at Mount Sinai, they received the law in 10 precepts. What came after the 10 precepts? Oh, the covenant code. The covenant code that textual critics say was adapted from the Code of Hammurabi. So this right here, what Peter's saying, this actually is, it lines up with various modern textual critics and their studies. But when Moses had gone up to the mount and was staying there 40 days, the people, although they had seen Egypt struck with the 10 plagues, and the sea parted and passed over by them on foot, manna also given to them from heaven for bread, and drink supplied to them out of the rock that followed them, which kind of food was turned into whatever taste anyone desired. And although being placed under the torrid region of heaven, they were shaded by a cloud in the daytime, that they might not be scorched by the heat, and by night they were enlightened by a pillar of fire, lest the horror of darkness should be added to the barrenness of the wilderness. Those very people, I say, when Moses, staying in the mount, made and worshipped a golden calf's head, after the fashion of Apis, whom they had seen worshipped in Egypt, and after so many and so great marvels which they had seen, were unable to cleanse and wash out from themselves the defilements of old habit. On this account, leaving the short road which leads from Egypt to Judea, Moses conducted them by an immense circuit of the desert, if perhaps he might be able, as we mentioned before, to shake off the evils of old habit by the change of a new education. When meantime Moses, that faithful and wise steward, perceived that the vice of sacrificing to idols had been deeply ingrained into the people from their association with the Egyptians, and that the root of this evil could not be extracted from them, he allowed them indeed to sacrifice, but permitted it only to be done to God, that by any means he might cut off one half of the deeply ingrained evil, leaving the other half to be corrected by another, and at a future time, by him, namely, concerning whom he said himself, a prophet shall Yahweh your God raise up to you, whom you shall hear, even as myself, according to all things which he shall say to you. Whosoever shall not hear that prophet, his soul shall be cut off from his people. So here, this story here that's in about Moses allowing them to sacrifice. In the Clementine homilies, which in this volume I've corrected the name to the popular sermons of Peter, it's like a sister document to the Nazarene Acts. And in that document, Moses never allows sacrifices. The sacrifices were added later by the priests. So there's two different versions of how sacrifices got incorporated into the worship of ancient Israel. The Nazarene Act says here, that Moses allowed it to be done because he couldn't get them to stop sacrificing, so he tried to minimalize the offense by allowing them to sacrifice to God. In the homilies, aka the sermons, it says that Moses never allowed sacrifices. So which is it? Well, from modern textual criticism, the sacrifices were added by the priest. From what the prophets say in the received text of the Old Testament, the sacrifices were added by the priest. So I don't believe Moses allowed them to sacrifice. I think that the version in the homilies is the more correct as far as we can tell. It seems that the sacrifices really kind of came into play during the time of Solomon and going forward from there. In addition to these things, he also appointed a place in which it alone should be lawful for them to sacrifice to God. And this was arranged with this view that when the fitting time should come, and when they should learn by means of the prophet that Yahweh desires covenant faithfulness and not sacrifice, they might see him who should teach them that the place chosen of God, in which it was suitable that the victim should be offered to God in his wisdom, and that on the other hand they might hear that this place, which seemed chosen for a time, often harassed as it has been by hostile invaders and plundering, was at last to be wholly destroyed. And in order to impress this upon them, even before the coming of the true prophet, who was to reject at once the sacrifices in the place, it was often plundered by enemies and burnt with fire, and the people carried into captivity among foreign nations, and then brought back when they betook themselves to the mercy of God, that by these things they might be taught that a people who offer sacrifices are driven away and delivered up into the hands of the enemy, but they who do mercy and justice are without sacrifices are freed from captivity and restored to their native land. But it fell out that very few understood this, for the greater number, though they could perceive and observe these things, yet were held by the irrational opinion of the vulgar, for the right opinion with liberty is the prerogative of a few. So basically Peter's saying that the people should have been able to figure out, when they were making sacrifices, they were constantly harassed by enemies and conquered and taken into captivity. But then while in captivity, there were no sacrifices. They were just, a people who were pursuing justice and righteousness. And then they were freed from captivity and restored to their native land. So, and Peter's right. That is what happened. That is the pattern of history that we see in the Bible. And yet the people can't figure it out. Jeremiah was standing in the temple speaking out against the sacrifices while the armies of Babylon were surrounding the city. And he placed the blame for the destruction of Jerusalem on the priests. He said, Jerusalem is destroyed because of you, speaking to the priests, because they were practicing this sacrificial system instead of teaching the people to observe righteousness and justice. But the people didn't want to listen. They weren't willing to learn. They weren't willing to observe what was going on and learn from the pattern that they were witnessing. Moses then, having arranged these things and having set over the people one Joshua to bring them to the land of their fathers, himself, by the command of the living God, went up to a certain mountain and there died. Yet such was the manner of his death, that till this day no one has found his burial place. When therefore the people reached their father's land by the providence of Yahweh, at their first onset, the inhabitants of wicked races are routed, and they enter upon their paternal inheritance, which was distributed among them by lot. For some time thereafter they were ruled not by kings, but judges, and remained in a somewhat peaceful condition. But when they sought for themselves tyrants rather than kings, Then also with regal ambition they erected a temple in the place which had been appointed to them for prayer. And thus, through a succession of wicked kings, the people fell away to greater and still greater impiety. So again, this also actually lines up with Professor Mendenhall and what he was saying about the temple cult was enabled by the priesthood. And so you notice the pattern here. They gave themselves kings, and then the kings, because of their regal ambition, they erected the temple. So it was all about a system of control. And if you watch my series on seeking God's justice, where we go through Professor Mendenhall's book, he lays out in detail how that happened. So the point is that Peter, he knew all this stuff 2,000 years ago. A lot of the things that he says in the Nazarene Acts is really just pieces of history that we've rediscovered in the last 200 years. But Peter knew it 2,000 years ago. But when the time began to draw near that what was wanting in the Mosaic institution should be supplied, as we have said, and that the prophet should appear, of whom he had foretold that he should warn them by the mercy of God to cease from sacrificing, lest perhaps they might suppose that on the cessation of sacrifice there might be no remission of sins for them, he instituted baptism by water amongst them, in which they might be absolved from all their sins on the invocation of his name, and for the future, following a perfect life, might abide in immortality, being purified not by the blood of beasts, but by the purification of the wisdom of God. Notice the underlined portion there is a point that I'm continuously making as we go through the Rock of a Sure Foundation, that the doctrines taught by Jesus, the doctrines taught by Peter and the other apostles, they all are about your works. It's about obedience, following the commands of God. In this instance, following a perfect life. In other words, you submit yourself to God and you follow His commands. There is no salvation through mere belief, like the apostate promoted. Subsequently, also, an evident proof of this great mystery is supplied in the fact that everyone who, believing on this prophet, who had been foretold by Moses, is baptized in his name, shall be kept unhurt from the destruction of war which impends over the unbelieving nation and the place itself, but that those who do not believe shall be made exiles from their place and kingdom, and even against their will they may understand and obey the will of Yahweh. So what's he referring to? Well, he's referring to the coming destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Those that were baptized and were following Yeshua, they would be saved from the destruction. And historically, we know that happened, that when the Roman armies were surrounding Jerusalem, the Christians recognized what was going on. They remember Jesus telling them, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee to the mountains. And that's exactly what they did. They fled the city. And they crossed the Jordan River, and they fled into the mountains to the city of Pella. And Pella became the headquarters for the Nazarenes for the next 300 or 400 years from that point forward. So this flight to Pella is what Peter is referring to here. These things, therefore, having been forearranged, he who was expected comes, bringing signs and miracles and his credentials by which he should be made manifest. But not even so did the people believe, though they had been trained during so many ages to the belief of these things. And not only did they not believe, but they added blasphemy to unbelief, saying that he was a gluttonous man and a belly slave, and that he was actuated by a demon, even he who had come for their salvation. To such an extent does wickedness prevail by the agency of evil ones, so that, but for the wisdom of Yahweh assisting those who love the truth, almost all would have been involved in an impious delusion. Therefore he chose us 12, the first who believed in him, whom he named apostles, and afterwards the other 72 most approved disciples, that at least in this way, recognizing the pattern of Moses, the multitudes might believe that this is he of whom Moses foretold, the prophet that was to come. So what is this delusion? Well, in the book of Isaiah, Yahweh says that he's going to choose their delusions, those that refuse to listen. They chose that in which he did not delight. And what he's speaking about in that section of prophecy is the sacrificial system itself. So these sacrifices, the meat eating, the gluttony, the wine, it dulled their senses, and it causes them to be under this delusion. There's a passage where Yeshua says in the the oldest copy of the Gospels we have is a Syriac version that dates back to the 300s, the oldest complete set of the Gospels we have. And in the Gospel of Luke, Yeshua is recorded as saying, "Don't let your hearts be weighed down by the eating of meat and the drinking of wine." And this, I believe, is what he's referring to here, is that these people, because of the delusion of this sacrificial system, that many people were not able to recognize Yeshua as the Messiah. That's the point that I think that Peter is trying to make here. But someone perhaps may say that it is possible for anyone to imitate a number. But what shall we say of the signs and miracles which he wrought? For Moses had wrought miracles and cures in Egypt, he also of whom he foretold that he would rise up a prophet like unto himself, though he cured every sickness and infirmity among the people, wrought innumerable miracles, and preached eternal life, was hurried by wicked men to the cross, which deed was, however, by his power turned to good. In short, while he was suffering, and the world suffered with him, for the sun was darkened, and the mountains were torn asunder, and the graves were opened, the veil of the temple was torn, as in lamentation for the destruction impending over the place. And yet, though all the world was moved, they themselves are not even now moved to the consideration of these so great things. But inasmuch as it was necessary that the Gentiles should be called into the room of those who remained unbelieving, so that the number might be filled, which had been shown to Abraham, the preaching of the blessed kingdom of God is sent into all the world. On this account worldly spirits are disturbed, who always oppose those who are in quest of liberty, and who make use of the engines of error to destroy God's building. While those who press on to the glory of safety and liberty, being rendered braver by their resistance to these spirits, and by the toil of great struggles against them, attain to the crown of safety, not without the palm of victory. Meanwhile, when he has suffered, and darkness had overwhelmed the world from the 6th hour even to the 9th hour, as soon as the sun shone out again, and things were returned to their usual course, even wicked men returned to themselves, and their former practices, their fear having abated. For some of them, watching the place with all care when they could not prevent his rising again, said that he was a magician, and others pretended that he was stolen away. Alright, so that brings us up to chapter 43. I think this is probably a good place to stop, so we'll pick it up here next time. Shalom.